distracted by the finer things in life. He looks shattered and he's broke, and all you have to do is find that guy who's perfect for you. And the fine line between wrong and right.
The old saying goes, your home is your castle. The door closes behind you. It's where you feel safe. So when violence erupts inside, it's all the more shocking. In 2011, in an affluent part of London, a quiet local man was found dead in his bedroom.
You can sometimes go to someone's address and you can find money in a drawer, in a wallet, or in a jacket pocket. But you don't tend to find thousands and thousands of pounds just lying around in bin liners or shopping bags.
If you find out how somebody lives, you stand a better chance of understanding why it is that they may have died.
When you live alone and you need help, you often have no choice but to let others into your life and home. But who you choose to admit can mean the difference between life and death.
Brook Green is, I would say, an affluent area. It's bordered by Shepherd's Bush and Hammersmith, so just a typically kind of diverse London locale. Expensive houses, expensive property, nice restaurants, nice pubs.
It's a nice area. So a murder, in fact any crime around here, is probably quite unusual.
Brook Green in West London was home to 58-year-old William John Saunderson Smith.
William grew up in Rugby in Warwickshire. I think his father died when he was around about 8, and then shortly after his mother was taken away to a mental institution. So he had a difficult upbringing.
William grew up with his cousin because his father died and his mother was taken into hospital because she had mental health problems. And this is quite a difficult and challenging start to life. And these things influence and affect and shape your worldview. May have left him feeling, that the world is not a safe place.
He had actually come from a tenant farmer background, and his family had money, but they were farmers. But then he had at some point decided to come to London to make his own fortune, and he certainly did that.
William had spent his money wisely, investing in property and making a living as a landlord.
He had a large portfolio of properties that he was renting out, particularly or primarily in the West London area. Majority of the properties that he was renting out in the London area, they were normally to Aussies or to Kiwis. And it's probably because of the transient nature of those individuals and because they would be working in the area of Earl's Court, he seemed to have a ready market that he was obviously supplying with accommodation to stay. He was obviously a wealthy individual.
While William was well off, it seemed he was not so comfortable with the outside world, and there was no sign of really close relationships.
William didn't have a big family. His parents died long ago. He had no spouse, no children.
William had had a difficult start in life, so unsurprisingly, he kept his life private. But to others, this privacy was unsettling.
He led quite a complex lifestyle. When he was having these properties renovated, he'd often fall out with the builders, owing them a lot of money. So the builders were trying to get hold of him. When he rented his properties out, he would often keep the deposits and they would try and get hold of him as well. So it was quite a complex character in that he owed a lot of people a lot of money, but he made it very difficult for them to track him down.
From what we understand, somebody who's pretty difficult as a landlord and, would use cheaper builders rather than spend the money. And for me, psychologically, this possibly speaks to somebody who saw holding on to money as a form of security, almost like a blanket of protection.
The jewel in the crown of the Saunderson Smiths' property empire was a large terraced townhouse in Brook Green. All of a sudden, in 2011, he evicted the students living there and moved himself in.
Although he was a multimillionaire, he didn't necessarily live an outward-facing, flamboyant millionaire's lifestyle. Rather, he was quite recluse, clandestine, and kept a very low profile.
The house in Brook Green became not only William's home, but also his biggest building project.
The property was in a huge state of renovation. On every single one of the 4 floors, there was building materials. He was doing it up.
His builders, he had entrusted them, I believe, on several of his building projects.
The property at the time, even back in 2011, whilst it was being done up, was probably worth in the region of £2 million.
Although residents on the road suspected William was perhaps converting it back to a family house, they barely saw their new neighbour. To some people, he was William Saunderson Smith. To others, he was simply known as John, his middle name. Being a local landlord kept him busy.
He took a lot of money in rent. He charged a lot of people the upfront deposit, but always collect the money in cash.
He spent most of his time visiting these different addresses, collecting his rent. He didn't really take much of the money to the bank.
And he had all this money, and over years and years, he led quite a reclusive lifestyle, so he had no real major means of spending this money. And so the money just built up. And this business model worked for a very long time until the banks clamped down on exactly where this cash was coming from, money laundering regulations, etc. And all of a sudden, he had all this cash, but there was nowhere for him to put it.
With the constant building work at his home, keeping track of his business started to get too much, and William John finally admitted he needed some help.
John hired an assistant on Gumtree, and this young lad, his job really was to try and put his finances in order and some sort of semblance of normality to his accounts.
William had started to let people into his life, but one morning it became clear that something wasn't right. On Friday, 21st of October 2011, he had arranged a meeting with the young assistant he'd hired.
On the morning he was supposed to meet with John. John didn't turn up, and so he came to the house. And because it was being done up, there was a newly painted sash window on the left of the door, and there was a clear mark on there that had been jemmied with a screwdriver or something similar. And the PA went inside and found John's lifeless body upstairs in a state of undress on the very top floor.
On Friday the 21st of October, William John Saunderson Smith had been discovered in the attic bedroom of his 4-storey house in Brook Green, London.
I was informed on the late Friday evening that William Saunderson Smith had been found battered about the head in his attic room. He was naked from the waist down. It would appear as if there was obviously a struggle in his attic room at the time. Therefore, that's where we started the investigation.
Detective Chief Inspector Howard Groves of the Met's Homicide and Serious Crime Command was appointed as the senior investigating officer on the case.
I visited the vicinity of the crime scene, but I didn't enter the crime scene. Sometimes when we watch television programs, we see the detectives in the murder scene walking around, picking up items and drawing crayon markings around the body and all those things. In reality, it doesn't happen like that. I don't want to go into a scene and contaminate it. Once the investigators, in terms of forensics, have completed their job, then I would go into the scene.
Detective Inspector John Finch was also on the team.
In the initial stages of a murder investigation, it looks like organised chaos. Everybody's got a job. You appoint your exhibits officers, your family liaison officers, house-to-house, telephones officers. Everybody's got a job. To an outsider, it might look a bit disorganised. But we held a team meeting, told everybody what we knew at this moment in time, set everybody their tasks, and they set about investigating the murder.
There wasn't any shops. It was just completely residential street. So did any neighbour hear or see anything unusual? A lot of people nowadays have CCTV on their front door, but it's still able to see the street sometimes from that. We knew that although it was a residential street, within 20 yards of that junction, there was a main road. And therefore, there should have been CCTV that would have either shown vehicles entering or leaving.
William lived alone, and there were signs of a break-in on one of the downstairs windows. What was immediately obvious was that, judging by the freshness of the blood and William's injuries, he had been killed in the last 24 hours.
The unusual thing about this case from the outset, I remember saying to my staff, we've got a whodunit because we knew where it happened and we knew roughly when it happened in terms of time, but we didn't know who committed the offence and why. So it was going to be taxing and demanding on us.
With so much police activity in the area, word soon spread.
I think someone had tweeted me that there was quite a lot of police activity. Our offices were only a couple of minutes walk away, and I remember talking to officers to find out exactly what had happened, and the early kind of answer was that someone had been killed in the building.
When we started investigating, we realised it wasn't going to be quite a straightforward murder investigation. One of the first things you do in a murder investigation is do your house-to-house inquiries. When we spoke to one of the immediate neighbours, they said that they heard sounds that they believe was people running up and down the stairs in the early hours of the morning, and that itself was very out of character and strange.
As police began to look into William's life, it became clear he was a bit of a recluse and had few friends in the area.
We had difficulty in identifying any next of kin. That took us some 3 weeks before we could identify someone. Normally, when you have an investigation, you will have a family liaison officer that is assigned to the family to keep them updated on the investigation. And we had to use a friend to do that because we couldn't identify a family member. And even that friend hadn't seen him for about 2.5 years. So we had some significant issues in trying to build up a better profile on the victim's lifestyle.
Police hoped they could find some forensic evidence at the scene that might shed more light on William and his killer.
Literally, to begin with, we had John's lifeless body on the top floor and not an awful lot to go on in the initial stages.
It took us a few days after the officers had obviously been at the scene doing their forensic work that we managed to lift a finger mark on the sash window at the front of the premises. But that didn't necessarily take us forward at that stage, because I remember saying to my staff, well, that finger mark may very well be from the victim. He could have easily been locked out of his address and tried to get in through the window recently. We knew that the finger mark itself was fairly recent, days old, not weeks old, which was good for us. But we knew until we actually were able to eliminate the victim, then the question would be, if it's not his, then who else is it?
A logical theory at the time was that William might have interrupted a burglary in progress before he was beaten to death. But searching the property further, police had made a surprising discovery.
Inside the house, it really was a building site. William was living on the upper floor, but important and interestingly, in the house, we very quickly found large sums of cash. There'd be £1,000 here, £1,000 there.
He would just put them in shopping bags and just throw them into a corner in his living room or his dining room. And that's something that neither myself or my team had ever come across. You can sometimes go to someone's address and you can find money in a drawer, in a wallet, or in a jacket pocket. But you don't tend to find thousands and thousands of pounds just lying around in bin liners or shopping bags.
Howard and the team concluded this must be collected rent money from William's properties. Before moving into his current address, William had been living in Fulham. A search of that address also revealed tens of thousands of pounds just lying around.
So that was very unusual. But that also brought with it certain issues that the team had to deal with, because from the moment that they informed me that they had found that significant amount of cash at both addresses, they had to stop what they were doing.
I've never seen anything like it. In total, we found over £350,000 in cash just lying around in uncounted bundles, an astonishing amount of money.
We had to therefore then get officers from a particular unit that would come and witness them counting the money and then securing it so that it can then be taken away. Because obviously one of the things we had to ensure is that the credibility of those officers was maintained, and for the organisation that there couldn't be any suggestion at a later stage that more money was there and we only retrieved X when there was Y. So that was an unusual thing. We'd never experienced doing anything of that magnitude before.
At the Brook Green house, officers eventually counted nearly £250,000 in cash, and there was even more at other addresses.
I'm wondering whether this almost obsessive collection of money, hiding it, not putting it in a bank, but putting it in various different properties, was a form of him feeling secure, having some control over his life. And what does money often give you? A feeling of, I've got everything I need around me, I've got security, no one can take it away from me, and therefore it gives me some sense of control over what happens to me.
With so much money still in his home, it was not immediately obvious what motive William's killer may have had.
Some may argue and say that this case has the hallmarks of a robbery that's gone wrong. I don't think that this is the case. Usually in cases whereby robberies have gone wrong, the assault, the violence tends to be quite moderate. In this case, there's evidence to suggest that the violence that was inflicted on William was quite extreme, it was aggressive, and it has the descriptions of overkill. And as such, I don't think that this case is a robbery that had gone wrong.
When William's autopsy results came back, they revealed he had died from head injuries caused by up to 9 blows with a blunt instrument.
William's death was a mystery for several weeks after the crime. Why would anybody seek to kill, especially in such a brutal manner, a 58-year-old man who, by all accounts, was completely harmless and kept himself to himself? There was no murder weapon found, and there was seemingly absolutely no reason for his ultimately savage death.
In search of a motive, the police started to look towards William's complex business dealings for suspects.
William's business model was to take up properties like this that needed renovating. He'd turn them into a number of different apartments, flats or rooms, and he would put a phone number on these rooms. He'd rent them out, he'd collect the rent, he'd collect the deposits, but then he'd get rid of his mobile phone. That property alone, we had 67 mobile phone numbers and phones that were attributable to him.
William's mysterious lifestyle was not helping to catch his killer.
If you find out how somebody lives, you stand a better chance of understanding why it is that they may have died.
The police investigation was soon to take a very different direction, as it headed far from William's home. In October 2011, the Met Police's Homicide and Major Crime Division were investigating the murder of reclusive property multimillionaire William Saunderson Smith, who had been found battered to death in the bedroom of his London townhouse.
For the first couple of weeks, we didn't have a suspect, there was nobody arrested. We were doing our investigation, there was an awful lot of material to be going through. There was a lot going on.
The police investigating William's death were baffled by the case and were struggling to either track down his next of kin or to paint a picture of his life.
We had to really try and reverse engineer his life to try and find out really what had happened. We understood from one friend that we could find that he was gay, yet we didn't really have any other understanding of exactly what his private life looked like. So to begin with, we had a number of different strands that we needed to look at to try and find if there was some sort of motive.
Even keeping track of William's phone contacts was a struggle.
I've never had a murder investigation where you've got 67 phones attributable to one victim. There was no phone that was particularly identifiable to be his current phone. All these phones just scattered around the 4 floors of his townhouse.
With bundles of money totalling nearly £250,000 left in William's house, robbery seemed an unlikely motive. In an effort to track William's last known movements, the police launched a media appeal.
There were plenty of gay venues in and around Old Brompton Road in Kensington, which he would often frequent, and that was another line of police inquiry in terms of, was this a sexually motivated crime?
We didn't discover too much about his lifestyle, his private life. We knew he was gay, but didn't really know anything more than that.
It seemed likely that William knew his killer, but with few family and friends to talk to, there were no obvious suspects.
Just because somebody is difficult, a recluse, has a secret existence, and might be not the world's greatest landlord and may at times have underpaid people, does not mean they deserve to be bludgeoned to death.
William had a number of enemies, upset a lot of people in his day-to-day dealings, whether it was his tenants that he hadn't given their money back, whether it was builders that he had disputes with or hadn't paid.
Through his business dealings, police found William had built up a list of people with a grudge against him.
There were a lot of people that we came across that, not necessarily a reason to kill him, but certainly a reason to dislike him. People who really didn't have any warm words to say about John, and that's a bit sad. And that made our investigation a little trickier.
Finally, the police got a break. They managed to get hold of footage from a nearby hotel security camera that showed the comings and goings in and out of Williams Road.
It's a one-way street, and down at the very end of the street there, before it hits the main road, on the left-hand side there's a property there, and that had CCTV, and that turned out to be pivotal in our investigation. So on the CCTV we saw 3 people. It was quite a mild evening, but in the early hours of the morning we saw 3 people that were dressed almost for winter, with their jackets done up and their collars done up, and the caps and hoodies up, hanging around, and that was quite unusual. Also on that CCTV we saw one car in particular that seemed to just go round and round and round the area about a dozen times in the hours leading up to the murder. And this was a gold-coloured Land Rover Freelander and had a big dent in the side, so it was hugely identifiable for our purposes.
It was good enough to tell us that at a certain time during that evening that a vehicle had driven into the road from the opposite direction. At least 2 to 3 people had alighted the vehicle. 1 person remained in the vehicle, and we surmised that that person was probably acting as a lookout, and that at least 2 other people then went in the direction of the victim's address.
The footage was too grainy to identify faces or the car's number plate, but the police now knew they were potentially looking for not just a killer, but killers. And the painstaking analysis of William's hoard of cell phones brought another breakthrough.
There was an awful lot of material to be going through. There were 67 mobile phones, and when we're going through those phones, we don't really find much on any of these phones. There's the phone calls, of course, but nothing else that's significant that leads us in any particular direction until we get to the very last phone, the 67th phone. And there's one text message on that phone that shows a little bit of emotion. It says, "How are you doing? ? Many kisses."
This was just a text in isolation, 2 months old, and we thought, is there a relationship between the victim and the person whose this text message has been sent to? So the alarm bells came up for us in terms of thinking, does this have some significance, some relevance to the investigation? It wasn't difficult for us to then establish who that particular phone number belonged to.
William had sent the text to a Polish man called David Reimar, someone who also knew William as John.
David Reimar was already a name that was in our system as a builder that had done some work for John in the weeks leading up to his murder. And so straight away, we thought, well, let's have a little bit more of a look at David Reimar. Could David Reimar be gay? Could he be a boyfriend of John's? We don't know. So we started looking at David Reimar, and that's really when the investigation took a significant turn.
We were able to establish where he lived. Officers visited that address. They weren't able to find him, but what they were able to establish is that Reimar hadn't been seen at that address for at least 2 days. His girlfriend hadn't seen him, neither had the landlord, and that was out of character. You'd normally see him at the address. His girlfriend would have spoken to him. So yet again, the lights are flashing for us in terms of why is this individual disappeared all of a sudden?
David Reimar lived in Acton, not far from Brook Green. But as they had his number, the team could access and examine location data to see where and when his phone was used.
His phone was in the Hammersmith area at the time of the murder. So what we then said was that he's one of those 3 individuals outside in the early hours of the morning when we think William was killed. And when we looked at his phone, he'd made phone calls as well, also in that area at the time. And he had made 2 phone calls in particular to Milosz and also to Mugiewski. Mugiewski worked at a bus garage locally, and that's where he knew Mr. Milosz from as well. So it was these 3 guys that became our prime suspects.
The suspects were Polish. They were builders by profession, and we believe that the victim had obviously used them because it was cash in hand. But we don't believe that the relationship with them was anything more than casual labor. They weren't someone that he had been using for years and years and years and had built up a significant rapport with. They were just people that he'd called upon on occasions to do particular work for him.
The builders would have known about him because they would have been in close proximity within a professional capacity. They worked for William on an ad hoc basis. As such, they had access to his properties and may have seen large amounts of sums in William's possession. Homicides in the UK tend to be a characteristic of a close proximity between victim and offender.
When we let new people into our lives, we look for reassurances they can be trusted from family or friends. William, however, had few people in his life, so when he opened his door, he was letting in strangers.
William had a reclusive, secret lifestyle. His sexuality, his financial status, not perhaps putting money in a bank, but more hiding it in some of his properties. And I think this then builds an image of quite a mysterious character. Now, if you think about it from the point of view of outsiders coming in, they may have a sense of secrecy. They may have a sense of, you know, this guy's underpaying us, but he seems to have a lot of money. What's going on with him? And this may give it a different potency in their eyes. How much money has this guy got, and can we get something out of him?
Winding back the hotel's CCTV footage to earlier on in the day of William's murder, the police could see 3 men arriving at the house, presumably to do some work for him.
They did a recce of the address before. You know, we were confident that they had driven around and had identified where CCTV footage was likely to be. They took all the back routes that they could to get to the address in the first instance, and we were able to prove that. They didn't go on the high roads. They basically doubled back from using the side streets, getting to the address, reversing the car around and heading back through the side streets. We were able to show that the 3 phones for those 3 individuals were all in a particular area at a particular time together. So they weren't at 3 different locations across London at the time the victim was attacked. They were all pinging close to the victim's address.
The CCTV also showed William leaving his house.
We found footage that showed the victim leaving his address and visiting a timber yard to get some items from there. And when he came back, we knew that the people who were working at his address on a particular day had left because the footage could show people leaving. So We wondered whether he had been deliberately asked to go away from the address to allow them to take away the money.
Whatever the men took, they obviously decided it wasn't enough.
On reflection, once they had left the address, they probably said to themselves, well, hang on, if we found that money, there's probably more, and hence the reason why they decided to come back. So it was greed.
They returned later that night by car, waiting for William to go to bed.
We noticed a Land Rover Freelander car, and this gold-coloured Freelander had a big dent in the side. Went past the property about a dozen times at the time of the murder, just before. And we managed to link that car to Mr. Bugievsky. He owned the car. So what we're saying is that Mr. Bugievsky took the other two to the murder scene. All three went in. They all came out, and then they made good their escape in Mr. Bugievsky's Freelander.
We were able to map where that vehicle went afterwards, and as a result of that, identify addresses where at least two other suspects resided at.
Using mobile phone data, the detectives continued to track the movements of the suspects immediately after the time William was killed.
Importantly, David Reimar left the country from Victoria Coach Station within hours of the murder. He had taken the first coach from Victoria Coach Station to Paris.
Bugievsky followed suit, leaving on a later coach to Paris to join up with Reimar.
There were photographs taken of them at the Eiffel Tower. We knew that some of the purchases that they'd made was more than likely would have been done by the money that they had recovered from the address.
The evidence police were gathering was pointing at William's builders, but finding them was going to be a whole new challenge.
It's all good having all that information and that evidence, but it was about apprehending those individuals now, because we still had three suspects at large. We had three prime suspects that weren't in this country. And then the question for me as the SIO was, how do we get them back?
In November 2011, police had identified the three men they believed had brutally murdered reclusive 58-year-old William John Saunderson Smith in his London home. Records showed that all three had now returned to their native Poland.
Normally, you'd be thinking about getting a warrant for them to come back, but that is a quite protracted and time-consuming process. And you know that the longer it takes you to get letters of request and for you to get the authority to get the warrant for them and then that to be executed, they could have easily well have moved on again from Poland and gone to another country.
It was 4 weeks since William had been murdered when Howard and the team discovered two of the suspects, Bugievsky and Midlars, had returned to the UK.
Having escaped to Poland and then thinking that the coast was seemingly clear, they returned to the UK, but little did they know police were already on their trail.
I think most certainly Mr. Bugievsky and Mr. Mulas, they had no idea that we were onto them. And I think they felt it was safe to come back to the UK. And they came back and they were wrong.
Police arrested the pair in their homes on November 18th, 2011. 38-year-old Slavomir Bugievsky was charged with murder. A week later, on November 26th, Irenausz Midlars was charged with the same. Bugievsky's car was also seized.
We did some forensic work on it, and we were able to recover at least 2 bloodstain marks within the vehicle of the victim. So that in itself was significant evidence, because we were then going to be able to say, why is the victim's blood in this vehicle? There's no reason why he should have been in it. Not only that, but there was a mixed profile within the victim's blood of one of the suspects, which would have indicated that at the time of the attack, one of the suspects must have attacked the victim.
There were now 3 prime suspects for William's murder, but what had happened that day in the house was still a mystery. One of the 3 builders, 24-year-old David Reimar, was still at large in Poland.
We thought, why not just give him a ring? We gave him a ring. We knew he was quite an overconfident, arrogant chap. And we said to David, look, we're investigating this murder. We know you know him. Can you come back, please? We want to have a talk to you about it. And he said, yeah, OK, I'll come back to the UK. I couldn't believe that he'd agreed to it. And I thought, well, maybe he's just going to go on the run now in Poland. But we bought him a plane ticket, and he got on that plane. And then when he came back to the UK, he was arrested off the plane.
William hadn't let many people into his life, let alone his home. But when he did, it seemed they had betrayed his trust in the worst possible way.
There's a notion in criminology known as the ideal victim, and the ideal victim is often vulnerable. And some of the vulnerabilities that William had in this case was wealth.
The police wanted to make sure the murder charges stuck. When they questioned David on his return to the UK, he gave nothing away.
He said, yes, I knew John. I'd done some work for him in the past as a builder. He didn't pay particularly well. But then I just chose to go back to Poland. I'd finished a relationship with my girlfriend and I just wanted to go back to Poland. We asked him why he'd gone via France, and he didn't really have an answer for that other than it was the first opportunity to get out of the country.
In terms of the text message, we were never able to establish whether there was a relationship between Reimar and our victim. But to be perfectly honest with you, that was not something that was going to concern us anymore. The mere fact that we were able to identify who that phone number was attributed to was enough. We didn't have to drill down into that anymore.
One thing that became hugely apparent to us was that David had money problems. Mr. Bugievsky, he owed people money as well. This, for us, we're saying, was a motive for the killing.
The CPS, on reflection, having looked at all of the mounting of evidence that we'd gathered in terms of forensics, in terms of phone data, in terms of CCTV footage, the CPS decided, yes, sufficient for them to be charged. And then, as they say, let the battle commence.
On Monday, 16th of July 2012, Reimar, Bugievsky and Midlars all went on trial for murder at the Old Bailey. All three pleaded not guilty.
The victim received at least 9 blows to the head and what we would have described as a blunt instrument. So it was a vicious attack.
The aim was to kill. It's as simple as that. Any trauma to the head can be fatal, regardless of force. The killers would have known this. He was brutally beaten to death.
This was one of the most shocking murder cases that I covered in my 4 years in Hammersmith and Fulham. Police were flummoxed at first, and it was such a violent crime and such a senseless crime.
I think this was a question in terms of why would they decide to attack him like that. It could have well have been frustration. He wasn't prepared to tell them where the money was. They were probably convinced that there was more money there. They had taken time and effort to go back to the address, probably thinking that they were going to find more money. And in the heat of the moment, they probably were frustrated and just decided to attack him.
Forensic evidence showed to the court revealed David Reimar's finger mark was on the broken window at William's house, and the blood found in Bugievsky's car was David and William's mixed together.
So when Mr. Bugievsky came back to the country voluntarily, he had said he had taken a taxi to Victoria Coach Station. And interestingly, the taxi driver that we spoke to remembers that Mr. Bugievsky had a roll of what he thought was about £1,000, and that he had no idea of how much to pay the taxi driver. And these were important facts for us that we were able to present to a jury.
In their defence, each of the accused tried their best to explain the evidence.
Reimar was asked, why is it that his blood was found in a mixed profile with that of the victim? And his defense was that he was attacked by the victim on the night in question, and he was defending himself. I think the jury discounted that very quickly and said, well, you know, it's at least 2 of you attacking him and there's 9 blows to the head. There can be no justification for that. They shouldn't have been in the property in the first place.
Interestingly, I remember, though, that when we were going through how much money was at the house, and there was a big bundle, a black bin liner full of cash, just by William's head. And when we told the court how much money was in that, there were tens of thousands of pounds in there. You could see all 3 suspects sort of rolling their eyes if, say, we've missed that. There was no doubt in my mind that they were guilty, but at that particular point, I knew beyond all doubt those guys had done it, and the jury agreed.
On August 10th, 2012, after a 4-week trial, all 3 men were convicted of the murder of William Saunderson Smith and jailed for life to serve a minimum of 30 years.
There was a definite sense of justice being done in the courtroom. The detail of what they put William through really was truly horrific, and they deserve every single day of their sentences. It was also a relief for the community, knowing that the 3 suspects were no longer at large.
The only family of Williams that the police had been able to find was the cousin he'd grown up with.
He would normally visit them at Christmas. He would always bring presents. He was quiet, but he was a loving individual.
William's story is incredibly tragic and painful because you've got somebody who is a recluse. Perhaps he may have issues around allowing people to get too close to him, so compartmentalised his life in quite a complex, complicated way. And what a terrible, tragic end to his own life.
I think his family, as any family, would struggle to come to terms with William's death, the brutality of it, the senselessness of it, and I'm sure to this day they still miss him.
William had tragedy in his life from a very early age, and sadly, it ended that way too.
Attracted by the finer things in life. You look shattered and he's broke, and all you have to do is find that guy who's perfect for you, and the fine line between wrong and right.
When you're part of a close-knit community that shares the same values and way of life, where everybody knows everybody, you'd think you would be safe and secure. But you never know what can happen behind closed doors.
When I heard about this young woman who'd gone missing, I was struck by how unusual an event this was. Police launched a proof of life investigation.
The name Proof of Life sounds encouraging. We were basically trying to establish if a person is dead.
The Scottish coast, with picturesque towns and quiet, calm locations. The last place you'd expect to uncover a story of abuse, neglect, and murder.
Inverkip, what a lovely location to live in. Sitting on the banks of the Clyde, overlooking the Argyll Hills and the forest on the other side of the river. And it always struck me as somewhere that would have been a lovely place to have grown up.
You would be very pleased if you got a house here with this sea view. So you don't believe that people go missing and never be found again. It's not a place that you would think anything like this would happen.
In the early 1990s, this idyllic area was home to the Fleming family and their daughter Margaret.
Margaret Fleming was the only child of Margaret and Derek Fleming. I think she was a very, very quiet child. She needed a lot of support in school.
Margaret had learning difficulties growing up, which wasn't diagnosed until later. At primary school, it was identified that she had problems with reading and writing, which later were revealed as learning difficulties. And this would have had an impact on friendships and how she related to other people and how other people related to her.
The family lived in the town of Port Glasgow, 10 miles along the coast from Inverkip. In January 1993, Margaret's parents divorced. Margaret was a vulnerable young woman, and now her world had been turned entirely upside down.
When Margaret was about 12 or so, she didn't get on with her mother particularly, so she moved in with her father and his parents.
She was very closely bonded to her father. She had quite a fractious relationship with her mum, but her and her dad were a little unit.
Margaret's father, Derek, was a tradesman who had retrained as a lawyer. He then met Jean.
I think we were about 3 years together. I didn't like him at first. Just, he was a lawyer. And then he says, "Oh, come on, I'll take you for a coffee." I went, "Aye, all right then." And we got on all right.
As she got to know Derek better, Jean saw his relationship with daughter Margaret firsthand.
Always together. Really. And wherever Derek was, Margaret was there. And it was lovely to see. She's quite shy, reserved. She'd take a while to get to know you. But when she did, she did. She clung on to you. She was really a nice little kid.
Jean and Derek eventually got engaged and started to make plans together, always making sure to include daughter Margaret.
And her dad told her we were going to get married. How do you feel about that? Well, she was a wee bit unsure about it at first. And I turned and said, "I ain't going to take your mum's place. Nothing's going to change." And she was quite happy about it. Unfortunately, her dad had cancer.
All parents worry about what they would do if they were unable to look after their children, and Margaret's father was no different. He had to find the right people to step in if the worst happened.
When he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, one of Derek's greatest worries was who would care for Margaret once he died. Fortunately, some of his stresses were alleviated when a couple came forward and voluntarily agreed to care for Miss Fleming.
The couple were Edward Kearney and Avril Jones. Derek had got to know them after doing some legal work for Kearney.
He said he'd known him for years, he trusted him and that, and I said, well, at the time I said to him, I don't like him, because I've got a gut feeling.
Edward Kearney was thought to have had his finger in many pies, business-wise, in that local area. He was a fully qualified deep-sea diver and practiced that career, which is well paid because of the enormous risks attached to it. So he's a man who had a physical presence, a physically strong man. Some people who had dealings with him would find him intimidating, and I mean that simply by his presence. As for Avril Jones, she was a secretary to a law firm in the area for many years and pursued a perfectly legitimate and ordinary life.
Margaret's father didn't feel that his parents could really cope with Margaret and felt that perhaps Edward and Avril could look after her better.
You know you're ill. You've made a connection with these two people who you've put your trust in, and to give your child over suggests that he really believed that they would take really good care of her and have her back.
Derek made the couple Margaret's legal guardians in his will. Sadly, his illness progressed very quickly.
We were going to get married. He fell ill, went to doctors, and within 8 weeks, he was dead. From the day he went into hospital, I never went home. I never left. I sat there beside him until he passed away.
After Derek's death, while his estate was sorted out, Margaret stayed with family in order to limit even more disruption to her life.
When her father died, she was absolutely distraught, really bereft. She had lost somebody who, well, perhaps the only person who really loved her.
She went with her grandparents at first. They were devastated when Derek died. It was the only child. It was sad. Margaret, she'd taken it really bad when her dad went away. Both Derek's parents then went into a care home because they were too old to look after themselves.
At this point, Avril Jones and Edward Kearney stepped forward to look after Margaret, now 16. Jean had no choice but to let Margaret go. But she was not convinced about the couple. There was an age difference of 18 years between Avril Jones and Edward Kearney.
A few times I had to go out there with Derek. I just didn't like the guy. Avril wasn't that bad, but she was controlled by him.
In 1997, 16-year-old Margaret went to live with Edward Kearney and Avril Jones at their home in Inverkip. It seemed Jean wasn't the only person unhappy with the arrangement.
At one point, Margaret's mother did turn up to the house and said that she wanted Margaret to come back home and live with her.
There had been a furious row, and Kearney had made some threats, and in fact, she accused him of relatively low-level violence towards her. He demanded of Margaret, who was in the house when this was going on, who do you want to live with, us or her? And Margaret elected to stay with them.
I got the sense that she was frightened of Edward and probably Avril, and maybe she felt she had no other option but to say, I want to stay here.
It's hard to imagine how Margaret felt, but as she became more reclusive, she also became more isolated from those around her.
Kenny was clearly an individual who was controlling and dominating, always wanted to be in control of himself, his emotions, and his surroundings. When he was unable to successfully do this, what he would tend to do is be confrontational and retaliate.
Margaret Fleming had been living with Avril Jones and Edward Kearney since 1997, and they had cut all ties with the teenagers' family and friends.
We never had any contact with Margaret, and that was even including Margaret's mother. They said Margaret didn't want nothing at all to do with us. Don't phone the house again, don't get in contact in any way or form. And that's what I done. I used to wonder, would she come and get in contact? Because I still had the same house phone number. I never changed it. She never phoned.
There was an occasion at a family celebration when Avril's brother and family had come up to Inverkip, and he heard this horrible moaning sound from within the house as he was speaking to his sister outside in the garden, and looking up and seeing Margaret, who appeared to have 2 lengths of cardboard tubing or guttering, some kind of cylindrical covering on her arms, and clearly distressed.
Avril's brother was told the tubing was to protect Margaret from self-harming.
Then there was a Christmas dinner where the Joneses family got together, but Margaret wasn't at that dinner. There were photographs taken, but Margaret wasn't in them, which struck me as odd. Would they not be asking, where's Margaret?
Margaret appeared to have vanished from sight, and it seemed no one was looking for her. In fact, no one would even inquire about Margaret's whereabouts for almost 17 years.
I didn't leave her. I was told she didn't want anything to do with me. And I wondered what she was up to. Did she get married? Did she have a family? You know. I did think Margaret would have come to me if there was anything wasn't gone right. You know, that she would get in contact with me. She never said. I thought her life was good.
Nobody heard from Kearney and Jones till 2016, when the Department for Work and Pensions received a new application for welfare payments from Avril on behalf of Margaret.
Avril Jones had been in receipt of benefit as being a carer for Margaret. The benefit system changed, so she had to reapply for a new kind of benefit called personal independence payment.
She requested more financial support. In the application, she stated that Margaret needed more care and attention.
Margaret would now be 35, and it appeared that in the last 17 years, her condition had badly deteriorated.
There was a list of things which indicated that Margaret was literally incapable of looking after herself even for a moment, couldn't be left on her own, she couldn't be trusted. She wasn't allowed into the kitchen where the dogs were because she had been found eating out of the dog's bowl. This raised eyebrows, as you might expect.
A local social worker telephoned Avril Jones to find out more.
Avril indicated that there was no way Margaret would speak to anyone or attend any appointment to be assessed because she was so terrified of authority and wouldn't leave the house.
But the social worker refused to be fobbed off.
She went straight round to the house herself without any answer. And at that, the concerns were so great in the mind of the social worker that she made an urgent referral to the police.
Late afternoon that same day, the 28th of October 2016, 2 police officers pulled up in a marked car at Avril Jones and Edward Kearney's home.
For obvious reasons, it was important that Margaret be seen and her well-being determined. They were able to see 2 figures moving towards the door after they had knocked the door. They then retreated, and one person came to answer the door, this being Avril. The officers were given access to the house. They found the most bizarre setup in the house with junk everywhere.
They were actually struck by the state the property was in. It was a very dilapidated house, very, very run down.
They went into the living room with Avril, who had immediately explained that she was the only person in the house and that Edward was out walking with Margaret. Now, the weather conditions were such that that was immediately unlikely. The female officer glanced out of the living room along a corridor which leads to the kitchen and saw, as it turns out, Edward Kearney kind of pressed in against the wall, she thought, as if trying to conceal himself, but able to hear what was going on in the living room. He had clearly been there the whole time. And so one of the officers then said to Avril Jones, "Well, is that him there?" And she feigned surprise that he was in the house. They asked the question, "Well, where's Margaret?" "She's in the kitchen," he said, making a show of opening the door, and then, as if startled and surprised, she's run away. She's gone.
When I heard about this young woman who'd gone missing, it did really intrigue me, because I knew the area where nothing much really happened, nothing much that was bad anyway. It was quite a community-orientated place. People seemed to look out for each other, and I was struck by how unusual an event this was.
The police had launched a missing persons investigation to look for Margaret Fleming, but soon discovered it wasn't going to be a straightforward case.
I would find it very hard to run away anywhere around here, because you've got this main road which is really dangerous and very busy, and then you've got the sea on the other side.
Because of the concerns for this vulnerable person, very quickly additional officers started arriving. And after a short time, CID officers were asked to attend as well. And so they asked Avril and Eddie repeatedly for detail as to where she had been, why she had fled, what had been happening. And it obviously struck Kearney quite quickly that the police weren't accepting this story. And he called out, "You know where this is heading, Avril? This will end up as a murder charge." Which seemed a distinctly odd thing to say if all that had happened was that the girl or woman in their care had run away minutes earlier.
Police immediately started tracing anybody previously involved in Margaret's life who might know anything about her whereabouts. Jean hadn't seen her since the late 1990s.
CID come to my house and they asked me, did I know Margaret Fleming? I went, "Oh, don't tell me they've done her in." That was my exact words. "Oh no, she's just missing." I actually nearly collapsed. And I couldn't get out of it. I couldn't sleep for weeks because I never heard anything. But as soon as the CID came, Andrew, I'm sorry.
Looking at the state of Jones and Kearney's home, detectives feared clues to Margaret's fate lay inside rather than outside.
The condition that that house was in was such, it was unlivable. It was a mess. It was contaminated with all sorts of stuff. What we'd be looking for here would be traces of Margaret in the house. Is there anything that indicates that she'd come to some sort of harm?
The detectives searched every inch of the house. They did not want to miss any evidence that would shed light on the miserable ordeal suffered by Margaret.
The police spent quite a time there trying to see any evidence at all that Margaret had been living there as they claimed. So, for example, are there any of her belongings here? Nothing. Toothbrush, even. No, she carries everything in a bag that she carries with her all the time, according to Avril.
They dug the garden, they searched the home, which I think was a very complex operation because the house was just full of rubbish. I think for the first time in Police Scotland's history, they set up a mobile laboratory in the couple's garden so they could test and analyse each item that came out of the house.
Everything that was handed over as being Margaret's was either Eddie's or Avril's, and when subjected to scientific examination, revealed no trace of Margaret's DNA.
Of all the thousands of objects that they tested, there was no sign of Margaret being there.
And that is something that is strange. And that is something that makes you think, has there been cover-up? Or has harm come to her some time ago? There was no forensic evidence to show that Margaret was in that house. But there was evidence from witnesses that speak to her being there, albeit some time ago. And that's important. So she was definitely in that house. She was there, it's just that she disappeared off the radar. And the only people that were there were these two carers.
In 2016, a search was on for a vulnerable woman, Margaret Fleming, who had gone missing. Her carers, Edward Kearney and Avril Jones, told police that she'd only recently run away. But a forensic examination of their house revealed no trace of her living there at all. Police feared a cover-up. Officers carried out an extensive physical search for Margaret and found nothing. But they weren't prepared to give up.
From quite an early stage, it was so obvious that the inability to find Margaret safe and well at that time was likely to be related to criminality rather than missing person. But there is a process through which the senior investigating officer must go before declaring a criminal inquiry.
When police interviewed Avril Jones's mother about Margaret's possible whereabouts, she immediately shot a big hole through the couple's version of events.
Avril's mother was astonished at the notion that the police would expect to find Margaret there because, as far as she was concerned, many years ago, Margaret had gone and had never been back.
There was a phone call between Avril Jones and her mother about the 5th of January 2000. Avril had told her mother that Margaret had gone off and had disappeared.
Avril had said to her mother that Margaret, who would have been 19 at the time, had left with a traveller.
The very idea that Avril's mother, who lives nearby, was telling the police, Margaret's not here and has not been here for years, whereas Eddie and Avril were saying she was here 10 minutes ago, didn't gel. It was pretty obvious, I think, that Margaret hadn't been there. There was a lie being told about her, and that there had been a lot of money paid out of the taxpayer's pocket on the basis that Margaret was there and being cared for. So it was very obvious that at the very least a benefit fraud had been committed.
Looking for Margaret was like searching for a ghost.
You had no phone data, you had no forensic evidence, no one had been in contact with Margaret for all those years, and then these two, her carers, were leading police to believe that she disappeared. So really, all the lines of inquiry around Margaret had dried up. They had nothing to go on.
Police launched a proof of life investigation. They made a public appeal to see if anybody across the UK had heard of Margaret, or come across Margaret, knew of Margaret.
The name Proof of Life sounds encouraging. We were basically trying to establish if a person is dead.
They contacted all the GPs in the whole of the UK, all the health boards, all education authorities to see if there was any trace of her. They made inquiries with banks and credit companies, but there was absolutely no sign of her on social media either. No digital footprint, which is unusual, for the days that we live in.
The police knew it would be hard to prove Margaret had come to some harm without finding her body.
The area around the house where they were living, Kearney and Jones, huge amount of land, trying to search for that body. Diggers, they looked in the river, they had divers, everything they could do. They had a drone up trying to identify an area where she could be buried. I mean, that's a mammoth task. And really, Kearney and Jones gave them nothing to go on.
The house is very secluded, so anything that would have happened there, or, if you like your privacy, that's where you would have your house. Because the only people that can see you is from the sea. There might be a boat passing, but other than that, nobody would see you.
It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, trying to find Margaret Fleming. The only time you can prove she was alive was when she was last sighted on the 17th of December 1999, when Avril Jones' brother says he last saw her.
The investigation into Margaret's disappearance made it clear that no one had seen her since 1999, and the only two people that could account for her whereabouts were Kearney and Jones, and their stories weren't adding up.
I wouldn't even look at a newspaper. I wouldn't look at nothing because I couldn't. I just crumble all the time.
There'd been stuff in the press, and a lot of it was negative. We knew there was a bigger story here. We were just basically trying to find it.
In 2017, 1 year into the police missing persons investigation, one of photojournalist George Wright's colleagues in the media posted a card through Kearney and Jones' letterbox asking for an interview.
About a week later, after he put the card through the door, that he got a phone call, and they wanted to tell their side of things because they felt like everything was on them, everybody was against them.
On the 4th of October, George and his colleague went to interview Kearney and Jones.
Memories that we're bringing back is a wee bit of trepidation going up to the house, just wondering what it was going to be like in there. Because we've seen it from the road, it looked really run down and dark and dank, and it was, definitely. So this is bringing it all back again. We weren't sure exactly what we were going to get, if anything. They might have just said no at the time and we wouldn't have got anything, but we spoke to Edward on the doorstep and he eventually let us in. He basically just asked him, well, where is Margaret? Tell us what happened. The story that they then came away with was so fantastical that at one point I was trying not to laugh because it was just unbelievable.
They actually said she was working as a gangmaster and she was running organised people trafficking and things like that.
And she was getting them to commit criminal acts for her, and she was the head of an organisation. But then 5 minutes before that, they had said that she was quite slow and she wasn't that bright.
Edward Kearney tended to want to take control. He wanted to do all the talking and not let, I think, Avril Jones speak at all.
They were actually asked on that interview, how did they feel that she's not appeared?
Normally, interviewees will say, well, please come home, give me a call. Even if we've had an argument, I want to hear from you. That's the sort of thing people tend to say in this situation.
They actually were quite vociferous. They didn't really like her. She was connected in drugs, she was involved in all sorts of things like that. So they were being quite nasty about Margaret.
I was raging. How dare you? Wrong. No. Margaret wasn't a gangster. She'd never get involved with MD like that. He just went to cover his back.
This is what it is now. Just boarded up. It's actually glad to get out of the house and actually get some fresh air because all the windows were bolted shut. There was no air in the house at all. It was horrible. All you were breathing in was dust and dirt. And then Edward showed us painstakingly where the police had dug up quite a lot of the garden. I don't know why he was telling us that. I think he was wanting to feel sorry for him. You know, look what they've done to my garden. They've dug it all up. Well, there's been good reason why it was dug up.
And with the interview, Kearney and Jones were digging themselves deeper into trouble.
After that, things just snowballed very, very quickly. The investigation was ongoing by that point. Police kept it really quiet. I think the police were watching for any discrepancies in what they were telling us and them.
They gave different accounts at different times, but the recurring theme was that in the first week in January of 2000, she had gone away with someone from the travelling community and was living in Cumbria with travelling people. They then finessed the account to include that she would come back very frequently to collect the money that was hers. They obviously had worked out they still had to pretend that they were not the beneficiaries of this money, that in fact Margaret was still getting it. And this was part of the hole they were digging for themselves. Because it meant that since they were insisting on that, if we were able to prove that wasn't right, it greatly undermined any credibility their account might have.
Police believe that Margaret died sometime between the 17th of December 1999 and the 5th of January 2000. She would have just been 19 at the time.
In an attempt to counter this theory, Kearney and Jones produced letters they claimed were from Margaret to prove she had left their house alive and well. Apparently signed and dated between the 9th and 13th of January 2000, the first was posted in Carlisle and the other two were from the Regent Palace Hotel in London.
Margaret had difficulties with numeracy and literacy. One of her teachers had said that she had a reading age of about 8 and would really not have been able to write the letters that they said she had written.
Spelling and grammatical errors were deliberately generated to give the impression that they had been written by someone who was not very good at writing English. The letters were typed and sent, one from the English-Scottish border and 2 from London. The significance of the one from the border is that it would have been on the route that Kearney and Jones would have taken to travel down to London, that they were laying a false trail of letters sent by Margaret to explain that she wasn't coming back.
Ironically, Avril Jones's log of another form of correspondence would later back up the police's theory about the period in which Margaret died.
Avril Jones kept this Christmas card book, which is a sort of odd thing to do. Don't know anybody else. I've never come across anybody who keeps a Christmas card book. And she would tick off people who had sent her cards, but also who she had sent cards to. And there was a tick on Margaret's name for 1997, 1998, 1999. But after that, there was no tick for any year subsequently.
With the investigation cranking up the pressure on them, Kearney and Jones were about to crack.
They were ready to go. Kearney and Jones were about to board a train. They had a large sum of money. They were going. The heat was on them, and they were heading on a train down south when they were arrested by the police.
On October 26, 2017, Edward Kearney and Avril Jones were interviewed at Govan Police Station in Glasgow on the suspicion of murdering missing woman Margaret Fleming way back in 1999 when she was 19 and they were supposed to be caring for her.
They were interviewed simultaneously. Kearney's response at interview was really quite farcical. He initially endeavoured to say no comment, but very quickly descended into personal abuse against the interviewing officer, clearly trying his best to unsettle him and avoid answering any relevant questions. He's a very, very arrogant man and insisted that Margaret was very much still alive and active.
Despite Kearney's bravado and Jones' silence, the evidence was mounting against the pair.
Avril, on the other hand, maintained no comment answers, but became upset a couple of times and insisted, for example, that Eddie knows where Margaret is. That was quite a telling point. But when tested or probed on the truth of what was happening with her benefit money, for example, and how often she would collect it, she was unable to be convincing at all about those sort of details.
The next day, Kearney and Jones were charged with Margaret's murder and were remanded in custody. As the news broke, the public was shocked as to how the couple had managed to hold their dark secret for 17 years.
People were really horrified about what had happened. There was probably a sense of guilt in the small village of Inverkip that Margaret had lived there, had disappeared, and nobody realised.
She never had a chance, did she? From the time the CID came to my door, I've never been right. I have a lot of regrets. Could I have done more to get Margaret? I really feel I let her down because I feel I never fought hard enough for it.
Margaret was really isolated from other people who loved and cared about her. And that feels incredibly tragic, that no one actually checked to see where she was and actually to see her face to face, but just believed the narrative that they were being given.
Margaret was simply a forgotten person. She was an individual that was vulnerable. We have this notion that because they're receiving guardianship and that they're receiving financial support from the state, that their well-being is catered for and looked after. Yet they're some of the most overlooked and neglected individuals.
Margaret had fallen through a crack in the system. Nobody, from the council or any other departments, social work and whatever, asked about her welfare or anything. Margaret being a missing person only came to light when the benefit system changed. But they've been claiming money for Margaret for years and years and years.
Something like £180,000, and the money had gone into Avril Jones's account as Margaret's carer. The couple did have some financial problems. They were found to have been in mortgage arrears. So there's a theory that They actually invited Margaret into the house deliberately in order to claim her benefits.
A person who's able to lie so elaborately about the killing of someone is clearly an individual who has depersonalized and dehumanized the victim. They consider the victim as an object. As such, they've been able to objectify their killing for just money.
Do you know, that's hard. That's very hard to accept another human being could do that to another kid. You know, a kid. That's bad. That's evil. Really evil.
On April 25th, 2019, 77-year-old Edward Kearney and 59-year-old Avril Jones went on trial at the High Court in Glasgow, accused of murdering Margaret Fleming.
Without having a body, to get a conviction for a murder, although it's not unheard of, it is one of the most difficult cases. No DNA, no forensic, you have no idea how the victim met their death.
But there was still plenty of evidence in this case. There was no proof of life. Margaret was not living. There was a Christmas card book which was ticked off for the years. That stopped in 1999. There was inconsistency in statements. They produced false information that she was still alive. They were writing letters.
Focus then came to be on what was going on in London on 13th of January 2000, and that was the date on one of the letters. Kearney and Jones were real hoarders. They did not throw anything away. And that turns out, on the one hand, they say, well, we don't throw anything away, and that's why we've still got those letters from Margaret. I'm glad we didn't throw them away because we can prove she was alive and well. Nor did they, however, throw away the invoice from the Regent Palace Hotel showing that a couple in the name of Jones had stayed there on the 13th of January 2000.
This meant Kearney and Jones happened to be staying in the exact same hotel on the exact same night that Margaret had supposedly been there and written a letter to them to explain her disappearance.
Without that, I'm not convinced there would have been a case. To find that invoice, that was a real stroke of luck. It's an astonishing mistake to have made.
Edward Kearney did himself few favours either when Ian McSporran cross-examined him.
He started contradicting things he had previously said, quite significant contradictions. It was a bit like nailing jelly to a wall. If one story didn't turn out to be any good, he would change it to another story. And since the two of them had twined their fate, really, although Avril Jones didn't give evidence, the damage he was doing to her as well. She maintained a fixed gaze forward for almost all of the trial. There were no betrayal of emotions.
There were so many inconsistencies, and there was no doubt when this was all presented together that Margaret had been killed by these two.
The jury found Edward Kearney and Avril Jones guilty of Margaret Fleming's murder. Both were also convicted of perverting the course of justice, and Jones was additionally convicted of fraudulently claiming £182,000 in benefits.
The reality is, criminal geniuses are very few and far between. The jails are full of people who aren't as clever as they thought they were.
Jones and Kearney were each sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 14 years.
They've never admitted to murdering the young women they were supposed to be looking after. And Margaret's body's never been found.
You'll find her in the bottom of the sea. I'm still convinced of it. Nothing will change me. She's at the bottom of the sea.
When killers don't confess to the crimes that they've committed, nor do they tell authorities where their victim's body is located, this for many is their last form of control. We know that Kearney is an individual who liked to be dominating, and as such, this is one of the last forms of control that he has over authorities, over the victim and over the victim's family.
What happened to Margaret is an unfinished, incomplete story. And psychologically, that can be deeply, deeply painful. Where is she? What happened? How did she die? We can't even bury her. We can't even honour the life that she had. So all these questions remain questions for the rest of their lives until these two people decide whether they're going to speak out or not.
But sometimes allegiances change. You never know. As Kearney's older, if he died first, who knows, Avril Jones might be able to tell the police in Scotland where Margaret Fleming's body is, to give them closure and do the decent things so they can bury Margaret.
Margaret's story is heartbreaking. She was a vulnerable woman who needed support, and the very people who were meant to be her protectors ended up betraying her in the most unimaginable way.
Margaret came from Port Glasgow. I want to get a bench to be put up in the shopping centre and get a plaque put on it for her so that she'll never, ever be forgotten. I wanted to bring her up as mine. She would have had a good life. Oh, she would have had a good life.